I think that because we're not seeing multiple coups, let's say outright coups in a year, that sometimes people forget that the intervention is constant. Also, US intervention is not just US military bases. There are some countries that have a lot of military bases. Neighboring Honduras is one of them. Another is Colombia, Mexico. But really that's not what military intervention is or what US intervention is. I mean, they have so much control over the region with all of their different operations that really these countries cease to be independent, if you believe that they were ever independent to begin with.
Hi, and welcome to our fourth episode of No Cold War Britain podcast. I'm Ileana Chan, and my co-host today is a very special, different guest, Sequoyah. Would you mind introducing yourself? Probably.
Yeah, by all means. Name's Sequoyah Souza. I'm in place for the usual and inimitable Fiona. We're very much looking forward to speaking to Camila and in her, as ever, beautiful surroundings.
We are really excited to be bringing you more in-depth discussions every month on the key issue of our time, stopping the US Cold War offensive and Britain's role in this major threat to world peace and prosperity. We will be bringing you voices from Britain and internationally to delve deeper into why this new Cold War is happening, what dangers it presents, and how we can build a movement to stop it. For our episode today, we are joined by Camila Escalante, a journalist based in Latin America. She is the editor of Kawsachun News, which provides news and analysis on Latin America, and is also a correspondent for Press TV. Welcome, Camila. Camila played a leading international role in reporting the mass movement that overturned the US-backed coup against Evo Morales in 2019 and 2020, effectively cutting through the mainstream Western media pro-coup narrative. So thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to this very informative conversation.
Thank you for having me, guys.
Great. So to kick things off, Camila, as a prominent journalist in Latin America, which is of course a key geopolitical region, and in a deeply and increasingly polarized world, with the US waging a Cold War on China, Russia, and the global South more broadly, where does Latin America fit in within this context, and what role does Kawsachun News and other similar news outlets play in covering Latin America's role in the world?
Well, thanks again for having me, and for always following Latin America. I know that you guys and Fiona, of course, are very much knowledgeable as far as far as the UK goes, and always watching what happens here. It's very I guess Latin America plays a very important role because you've probably heard some of the sound bites that we've published on Kawsachun News from the Southcom commander, General Laura Richardson, but also other US officials, senators who have spoken about the great resources that Latin America has. Generally speaking, they're talking about South America, but they're speaking about all of Latin America and the Caribbean. Obviously, they're talking about oil. They're discussing the massive food production that takes place here. I'm on an island in Nicaragua. It's called Ometepe Island, and it's relatively small, but this island actually exports food to Costa Rica, to El Salvador, to Honduras, not to mention all the rest of Nicaragua. So it's obviously just a very important part of the world that has mineral wealth. It has a lot of lithium reserves, of course, in Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile. And so a lot of people have been talking about it, and that includes Russian President Vladimir Putin. That includes, obviously, Chinese officials. And because of, everything that's been going on, whether it be the NATO proxy war in Ukraine against Russia, and everything else, these countries, NATO countries, are looking for other sources of sustaining themselves and looking to exploit different parts of the earth. And so everyone has their eyes now on Latin America. And I think that's something that that we're going to see a lot of going forward. And we saw once again just recently that Latin America came back to the news. You can watch entire cable news programs and read the entire newspaper or whatever it is. People mostly get their news from online publications now, but Latin America was kind of in a lot of ways out of the news for a long time. Even independent journalists weren't coming here. There's absolutely no money in reporting on the ground in Latin America. It's not lucrative at all. It's literally always going to be volunteer work for the most part. And but it came back into the news recently because of this dispute over a region that is considered to be part of Venezuela, also considered to be part of Guyana, which is the Essequibo, where massive oil reserves were found. And the largest proven oil reserves today are still in Venezuela, but a lot of the recent drilling we've seen by ExxonMobil has taken place in the waters of Guyana, and there's even more resources in this disputed territory. And so what we saw during the last few weeks is an absolute frenzy in the mainstream media in which Bloomberg, CNN, Al Jazeera, and I think it's BNN, or kind of like or CNBC, which is like the financial news network of MSNBC. They all interviewed President Ali, the president of Guyana. And, we don't even get a voice in the international media. So in the span of days, the president of Guyana, a country that has like 1 million people living in it, really small in population, was plastered all over cable news and was giving all sorts of interviews over the situation because, of course, the international media wanted to give a voice to anyone who's willing to call President Nicolas Maduro an aggressor or say that Nicolas Maduro is trying to take over the small neighboring country. So it just shows that, there are a lot of eyes on Latin America right now and its resources. And the other person they were interviewing, besides the president of Guyana, was the CEO of ExxonMobil. On CNBC, they interviewed him and asked how this dispute, if it's going to continue to intensify or get more hostile, which hopefully it doesn't, how that's going to affect the operations of ExxonMobil in the region. And so that's really, it's really frightening that, the way in which they talk about our region as if it's not like hundreds of millions of people living here. They talk about it as just like a destination to go get resources and to exploit those resources and to take the profits out of the country, to not benefit any of the indigenous people or the populations of those countries, not to invest in social programs or anything like that. So what we aim to do, just going back to your question, what role does Kawsachun News play in all of this? Well, we just need some fighting chance at having a voice here in Latin America. And, English is obviously one of the most spoken languages. It's really important for us to be able to connect with our brothers and sisters in the Caribbean, in Africa, and in Asia, and in other parts of the world, like Palestine and Iran. And so for that reason, we've focused on doing a lot of translating what takes place here, what the perspectives are here, how people see themselves and their movements and their popular governments and the struggle against imperialism, which is ongoing, especially as we as we're in the context of 200 years since the Monroe Doctrine. And there's a lot to protect here. And obviously this part of the world has a very different perspective on all of the global events, and that's what we try to highlight.
Speaking of, I guess, mainstream media focus and also underreported voices, Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza right now is what everybody seems to be talking about. It's dominating world politics today and has sparked an unprecedented global movement in solidarity with the Palestinians. Although that may not always be reflected in mainstream news. But can you tell us about the responses of governments and social movements within Latin America to this? I mean, that's a very big question. I realize there are many different countries and perspectives, but can you give us sort of an overview on that?
Yeah, it is a really big area to cover, but I would say in general, people here are not indoctrinated with the same sorts of things as we are in the global north. I grew up in the US, and I now have more of a life, let's say, in Canada. But growing up in the US, I grew up in Arizona. There is only one genocide that we speak of. There's only one huge atrocity that you're taught through all of your civic and history classes, starting in, I guess, middle school and high school, maybe a little bit in elementary school. But we discuss what happened to the Jewish people during the Holocaust. And I know it's even to a greater extent sort of articulated and taught in a very specific way in Germany and in other parts of largely Western Europe, which, I've been able to visit those sorts of places where there's a lot of street art, graffiti about Anne Frank and all sorts of different things. I think what becomes really unfortunate is that this history is taught, and what is still lacking in places like the US is a proper history of the enslavement of African peoples and of colonialism and of modern imperialism. And we also don't talk about, and that's only just to talk about the things that are lacking in the curriculum with regards to US history and with regards to the way in which they lack in terms of teaching decent history of the dispossession of indigenous peoples there locally. Never mind, proper lessons and curriculum on the colonialism and how it worked in Latin America and the Caribbean and other parts of the world. So a lot of people have this lack of understanding. And even with the disadvantages we have in Latin America in terms of development, in terms of having properly equipped schools with modern technology and internet and devices, a lot of people, especially in more remote areas where there are large indigenous populations, don't have the same access to smartphones and laptops. But we do have a better understanding overall of the role that Spanish colonialism and other colonizers played in our region. And I think people also have a little bit better of an understanding of the different different ways in which those sorts of atrocities, which were essentially a genocide of indigenous people, sometimes the genocide of Afro-descendant people in these different countries of Latin America, how those things have been reoccurring. They actually haven't stopped. Particularly, last century, we saw many massacres here in Central America, in El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, against these sorts of US-backed crimes that were committed against popular movements and uprisings who were fighting against US intervention and foreign intervention during the height of sort of this neoliberal period. And so we experience all sorts of dictatorships and different things. And I think that people here in Latin America are able to make the connection that the forces that are arming the Zionist entity there in that region of the world in occupied Palestine are the same forces that have come here to Latin America, and beginning in the early 70s, sold arms and provided a lot of security cooperation, training of the parastate groups, the paramilitaries who killed people here, as well as the actual militaries, the armies that massacred innocent people, civilians that were accused of nothing more but being communist or being, in the case of El Salvador, being linked to the FMLN, the Frente Farabundo Martí, which was the front of the different communist and leftist groups that rose up against the dictatorship. Israel played a role and those atrocities here in Latin America. And thankfully, some people haven't forgotten. We also know that, you know, I think a lot of people have a little bit more of a closer connection to the issue of displacement due to things like transnational companies that come here to exploit natural resources. And they know, the struggles of some indigenous peoples who continue to have to negotiate and dialogue with national governments, including socialist governments, in order to decide the destiny of those lands and the resources that exist there. But we're also having to, it's like, it seems like the whole continent, a lot of it is largely still in dispute. That there are still forces, the forces of foreign capital that are trying to trying to pillage all of these lands. And so I think people understand that that is sort of what's taking place in occupied Palestine right now, that that the Zionist forces have long been displacing people, taking them away from their homes, sending them into exile, killing them, carrying out acts of extreme violence for many decades now, and that now what's taking place is a Holocaust. Now it's a genocide that is, very, it's just absolutely shocking, and every part of it becomes more and more just more absurd and detestable. And so I do think there's a little bit more of sort of a connection there. And thankfully, there is a very long history within many countries, Chile, Bolivia, Brazil, and many others, obviously Cuba through its School of Medicine, that have had different forms of exchanges, people to people relationships with the people of Palestine. And many people have gone on brigades to Palestine, to Gaza specifically, to see what the conditions have been like, in the last couple of decades. And that's a really important link that our people have to the people, to the Palestinian people. And so I think for that reason, it's the kind of viewpoints that we see here, and the I guess people's analysis of what's taking place has been a little bit more accurate, a bit more fair, and the media tends to have to be a little bit more fair. At least we have some media outlets in Latin America that aren't just pure Zionist propaganda. And so I think people are watching very closely. They're very attentive to what's taking place. And we've seen a lot of solidarity from, obviously, the most important social movements and leftist governments of the region with the people of Palestine during this time.
Just a very quick, before we move on to a slightly different area, quick follow-up question. You've been recently based in Canada, covering a lot of protests and solidarity actions over there. Could you give us just a quick insight into how that sort of compares with some of that and the level of understanding in Latin America?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think that the way in which the response is comes about or is articulated is like completely different. Here in Latin America, the basis of a lot of actions, whether it be like a mobilization or a protest, is an already existing union structure or social movement. And everyone in the global north, on the other hand, is a little bit more fragmented. So it's really inspiring to see so many people go out in the global north, especially in London, obviously, London, England, but also London, Ontario, and all these major cities in the global north. The question remains how that's going to be sustained, how this sort of outrage can be used and what those people are doing to make demands. Because on the one hand here, well, let's take like a bigger city. When you see people in Santiago, Chile, taking to the streets in very large numbers, because it's a country that has a huge Palestinian population, Chile, you see them calling for Gabriel Boric to break once and for all relations with Israel. And that's very important. And it's a very important demand. But at the same time, the calls need to be much stronger from the global north. And I'm not sure that people know this, because there is probably some security cooperation and some other forms of trade between Chile and the state of Israel. However, it's far larger from other countries. I mean, the largest and most important in Latin America would be Colombia, but you know, the demands really need to be made from those countries that are key allies of the Zionists, who are really arming this genocide. I don't see it as a genocide being committed by, you know, so-called Israel. It really is a U.S. outpost. And so the U.S. isn't backing this. The U.S. is committing this. It really is committing. It's very closely traceable and easily traceable to every, you know, atrocity that takes place anywhere. And so I think that it would be very important for people of you know, Canada, the UK and the US to make demands of their own governments, because it really is these governments that are arming the Israeli occupation forces, that are providing the necessary technology, the necessary components of weapons. And of course, that's why we've been seeing these direct actions being taken against these weapons manufacturers and these different companies. And that's really important. And they do need to target those, and they need to target their own governments. I just want to make a comment because I've seen people, particularly in the US, and some of these mobilizations that have taken place, some of these protests, making demands of Netanyahu, making demands of Israel, but they need to be making demands of their own government, because the government of the United States is supplying billions and billions of dollars in supports for this to take place. Really, the US could end this immediately, in an instant. All of this could end if the US government called on Israel to cease its mass killing. And so there's no need for people in the global north to be making demands of other people's governments or other sub-governments, or the people who are the face of the government, because really there's only one imperialism, and that's the United States. It is the United States who's committing these atrocities. And you know, people are talking about tribunals, they're talking about how we're going to hold the different people accountable for what's taking place here. I'm not even sure who they're talking about. I would really like to know who they're talking about, because if you ask me, the people that need to be held accountable are not just every single person who has been enlisted and participated in the so-called Israeli Defense Forces, and every single person who's been a member of the government of Israel, but also all the US lawmakers, everyone in the US government, because that's where the funding and that's where all the weapons come from. Those are the people who need to be held accountable. And I think what's going to happen is that the outrage is going to, it's going to look as if it's subsiding, because people in the global north don't really have the means of sort of, you know, projecting their outrage in the right direction that is targeted towards the places that could really make a difference in all of this. And unfortunately, it'll just be like another election stunt. Whatever takes place going forward has to be understood within the context of US elections and those sorts of timelines. So I think it's important that what has been achieved in the last 2.5 months is that, thanks to you know, the use of social media by Palestinian journalists in Gaza, that we've been able to see what's really taken place there. And so it's absolutely undeniable. And that has broken through the media narrative. And that's really important, because people are going to, just regular people who don't see themselves as overly political or plugged into the news, are beginning to see what's taking place and seeing that everything that is shown to us in the mainstream media is completely false. That is a very positive thing that's taken place, is that people are beginning to question everything and beginning to question those narratives that are that we are exposed to beginning in elementary school. But at the same time, you know, I wish the global north were a little bit more poised to respond to what's taking place. But that being said, I think that the sort of, you know, my takeaway, even before October 7th, the last time I was in Toronto, if you guys might have seen, I was doing reporting for Press TV on the Palestinian the Palestinian protests that were taking place there. You know, it's been one of the most incredibly important movements in the global north, is, you know, the Palestinians, and of course the different sort of Black organizing, just to put it under one umbrella, has been the most promising. Obviously, even the global south can look to the United States as an example with regards to the Black Power movement and everything that took place there. And the other movement, of course, being the Palestinians, who every year commemorate a different set of days, whether it's Al-Quds Day, whether it's Nakba Day, and they always go out to push back against the crimes of the Israeli entity anytime anything happens. And they're doing very important organizing on university campuses. Maybe you guys were a part of that as well, because I know that exists in universities over the pond as well. And so I like all the credit to all those Palestinian organizations in Canada who I was reporting alongside, and also you know, elsewhere in the global north for their response to what's taking place.
Thankfully, there are solidarity movements across the global south with Palestine, global north, etc. However, there are also right-wing forces, both domestically in Latin America and globally. Thinking about Argentina's latest presidential election, it saw the victory of the right-wing candidate Javier Milei, which has seen a turn from the previous more progressive government. Clearly, there are divisions across Latin America, with both a resurgent, some would describe more progressive governments on the rise in some areas, at the same time a growth of more far-right forces. What role is the US playing in this context? And also, how does this relate to the far-right movement and or insurgents globally?
I think that the United States is happy so long as you know, communism and anti-imperialist forces are stomped out, that they're made to be more fringe, that they're made to be less mainstream than they have been in you know, last century, let's say the second half of the last century in Latin America. And ultimately, I think that's their goal. I think that the imperialists know that only you know, these genuinely these forces that genuinely oppose US intervention and US militarism, that those are the only ones who will be able to topple, you know, the Monroe Doctrine and the US project in our region. And so their ultimate goal is to make sure that these groups that that were, you know, founded on you know, the sort of ideologies of Marxism and Leninism, and who took up arms last century and were very clear about what their objectives are, they're trying to phase those out altogether. You know, the US does so in the form of they're intervening in Latin America in trying to, I guess, prime different sorts of candidates for elections to ensure that that no, you know, sovereign or, you know, self-respecting government comes to power. And so they have their hands in all sorts of processes around the continent. And that hasn't stopped. I think that because we're not seeing like multiple coups, let's say outright coups in a year, but sometimes people forget that the intervention is constant. Also, U.S. intervention is not just U.S. military bases. There are some countries that have a lot of military bases. Neighboring Honduras is one of them. Another is Colombia, Mexico. But really, that's not what military intervention is, or what U.S. intervention is. I mean, they have so much control over the region with all of their different operations that really these countries cease to be independent, if you believe that they were ever independent to begin with. They really just cede a lot of control of what happens to the US. The US sends advisors. And I don't want to make an example of any specific country. I do feel like people feel like their country, that I'm attacking their country when I name them, but there's just an infinite amount of examples of the way in which different governments of Latin America and the Caribbean have ceded control of their territory or of their government and of their economy, et cetera, to the U.S. authorities. The U.S. authorities sends military generals to train their police, to train their military. They provide a lot of things like helicopters and sea vessels under using the pretext of combating narco trafficking. Sometimes they talk about human trafficking, and also to combat climate change. And they say that to combat climate change, they have to provide hundreds of millions of dollars in military arms to these countries. I mean, obviously, it's not for that purpose. It is for the purpose of militarizing our region in order for them to prepare for war against China, and also to position itself with regards to Russia's positions in the world. But the intervention is pervasive, and it's permanent. And right now we're seeing a huge campaign of U.S. intervention right now in countries like neighboring Honduras, which experienced a coup in 2009. And they were finally able to, the people of Honduras were finally able to retake power just last year. It'll be 2 years in January with the election of Xiomara Castro. And they continue to face, hostility from the US and coup attempts from the national right wing in the country, which is aligned with the United States. And so that is just exceptionally dangerous. I think we're living through very dangerous times in Latin America, where we could just go through every single country of this region and talk about the ways in which the U.S. is trying to intervene. And for the first time since the government of Honduras took office this week, the U.S. announced these sorts of measures. I don't know if they're calling them sanctions. I can't remember how they've framed them, but these very it's a type of propaganda. They have taken away these visas of Honduran officials because they say that these Honduran officials are participating in anti-democratic acts in the country. And these officials are all of the Partido Libre, the governing party. They are people who fought against the dictatorship of Juan Orlando that was, backed by the United States. And these people didn't even apply for visas in the United States. So the US State Department announced that they no longer have visas to come to the US and that they're being taken away because of their anti-democratic acts. And they had never even applied for visas. I mean, it's absolutely absurd. They're just trying to find a way to say that, continue this sort of line that Latin America and Central America specifically is a corrupt place. And of course, that goes hand in hand with their claims and their framing about the reasons why people migrate to the United States, the reasons why so many poor people in particular go to the United States to seek economic opportunities. The United States is really behind the entire idea that it's because our governments are corrupt, because our governments, funnel money from different what should be different infrastructure projects and things like that, and they pocket it. But it really, the real reason behind the very slow development process that we're going through is just the permanent campaign of intervention by the United States and other imperialist forces. And so so like just to wrap it up, that the US just has a hand in absolutely every single country of Latin America and the Caribbean. And the only thing, the silver lining is that 4 countries in particular, Bolivia, Nicaragua, Bolivia, Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela have banned the United States from coming into their countries and have completely expelled the presence of the US military, including the other sort of agencies like the DEA, and also on a whole US nonprofits or NGOs. And that has really ensured that these countries can move towards that they are independent and that they can move towards development with whichever partners they choose. And so long as those other countries are not doing that, so long as they have such a heavy US presence, they can't be considered to be independent. And that goes for Mexico so much as it goes for Colombia, so much as it goes for Chile and Argentina and Guyana and Jamaica and Haiti and many other countries. So, I mean, for me, I would say this is the sort of thing we look at. A lot of people want to put governments on a left-right spectrum. And I think it's very important to look at countries and governments on the basis of what have they done to concretely ensure that they're able to make sovereign decisions and implement them, and implement their different campaign promises, or the different things that they promised during the election period, or that their political parties are promising to the people. The only way they can ensure that sort of transformation, that sort of fundamental transformation of the state, is through being in control of the state. And they can only do that through the expulsion of those imperialist forces from the country.
Because of this lack of sovereignty, like you're speaking about, and just really the far-reaching consequences of American imperialism, I think a lot of people are looking at BRICS, which is, for those who might not know, an informal alliance among Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. In September, they announced an expanding of BRICS. So some people sort of looked at that expansion of BRICS as maybe a way to expand sovereignty of these countries. And some people were maybe a little bit more forceful in their optimism and believed in de-dollarization. How do you feel about this? In your perspective, how does Latin America fit into this sort of idea about BRICS being an alternative to the unipolar American capitalism?
Well, Latin American countries are certainly looking for alternatives right now. We saw the ways in which our countries were so heavily affected by COVID, and of course by the Ukraine proxy war. And so, I think that kind of maybe snapped a couple of governments out of a slumber, which I think is very important. At the same time as China has approached our governments, and Russia and other countries as well. And so I think that, speaking from Central America, the government is very open to, the government of Nicaragua, where I am, is very open to alternatives. And I think that it's very pressing, important that we find different ways of carrying out trade, and that we can bypass and circumvent the different sanctions that have affected our economy so heavily, especially a really key economy like Venezuela for the last almost 10 years. And so I guess, BRICS poses some sort of a alternative, and that could come under siege now with the election of Javier Milei in Argentina. I think what's at stake right now is Argentina's relationship with Brazil. And those are really important, large economies in our region. And unfortunately, that's going to have a ripple effect for the rest of South America and our region. We know that countries like China have the capacity and the wealth to be able to provide a lot of help for small countries like Nicaragua. But we also have Brazil, which is, a large country with a large economy that actually could have the potential or has the capacity right now to provide loans for countries like Nicaragua, loans that would be otherwise be blocked by the different sanctions that are being imposed by the United States and by countries like Canada and the UK or even the EU, who have copied over the same sanctions. They make it impossible for Nicaragua to receive help from these international financial institutions. And so, I guess I guess it remains to be seen, as far as I can tell, what countries like Nicaragua can do in order to circumvent the coming sanctions, which the U.S. is pursuing. But that is one of the different things that exist, is our relations with China, the relations of countries like Central America with China, which I know you guys wanted to talk about China and Latin America. And it's really important because a lot of the U.S. allies in our region have relationships with China, despite that the U.S. would try to forbid it. And one example of that is that in 2018, one of the last things the FMLN did in El Salvador was that they initiated relations with China. And under the current Nayib Bukele government, which is a neoliberal government, or right wing, or however you'd want to characterize it, it's certainly the opposite of the FMLN. They have maintained those relations, and they have seen the completion of at least a couple of really important projects. And so despite being a close US ally, we have, a lot of governments in the region and countries that are looking to China in order to help us move forward within the context of our slow development as a result of, obviously, colonialism.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Camilla. And sort of moving forward with that theme around China, despite the Western media's portrayal of China's rise as sort of threatening and negative force in the region and globally, many countries have, in fact, as you've described, increased their cooperation and have joined, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative. Just sort of digging a little bit deeper into it, what has this development meant for those countries? And just thinking how this looks like specifically, could you sort of give us a few illustrative examples and what that actually means for the people of Latin America?
It is so important. I can't even begin to express how important it has been for the different countries. But just to tell you, what it's looked like for the countries that I've lived in. I was based for a few years in Bolivia, and China has helped construct a really important highway expansion, the widening of a huge highway. There are areas in Bolivia that are so remote. It's actually something that Bolivia is known for. It's known for having really precarious roads, to the point where even the vloggers that were around like 20 years ago, before social media, or like these like sort of small time documentary makers or whatever, so many people have gone to Bolivia to sort of document like what things are like there. But it has been very difficult for small producers to get their products to market, to get them to international markets, to be able to make money. And so that really has a profound effect on the ability of people in rural areas, in a country where people still live in rural areas. They don't live in cities. It's very difficult to see even development there. And so China's help in providing the expertise and resources to expand these highways is just absolutely critical, because it means that things are going to change very rapidly, and things have already changed really rapidly thanks to the movement towards socialism led by Evo Morales in the last 16 years or whatever it was. And you know, a lot of people were taken out of extreme poverty, but poverty still exists in our countries. And so this is really going to help, you know, connect, you know, rural peoples to the rest of the country. And we're going to see just huge economic development within these different regions of the country. And the same can be said for here in Nicaragua. It's a very small country, and well, one of the important things that China is doing here is that they have signed an agreement with the government of Nicaragua to essentially build a new airport. The airport right now, there's only one major international airport here, and that's the Augusto Sandino airport in Managua. But because of its location, it would be impossible to expand the length of the runway. And so that really affects, you know, that's going to have an effect on the economy in all sorts of ways. It affects tourism. It affects how many flights can arrive here in a day. It means that we're kind of at the actual limit to what can be carried out through this airport. And so not far away, just north of Managua, there is an existing aerial base that is going to be converted into the new international airport here. And that's going to open all sorts of doors for all sorts of things in terms of bringing more people here, for whether it is for business, whether it's for tourism or anything else. And it's going to take place in record time because China has the capacity to help Nicaragua accomplish that, but also because it's already an existing airport. And they're also going to be building or assisting Nicaragua in the building of some railways that go across the country, both sort of in a north-south direction, I believe, that will connect major cities and will really help with, you know, getting products where they need to go. But also there should be soon a railway in the works that would be transoceanic, which means it would connect the two coasts of Nicaragua, which would make it much it would help facilitate the exporting of products from this country. This is such a highly productive country, and as we always discuss, Nicaragua produces more than 90% of its own food and is always looking to increase production along the lines of the same model that Bolivia has used. And they want to, of course, export more to the neighboring countries of Central America, but also to markets like Russia and China, which are massive in comparison to Nicaragua. And so that's really going to help facilitate that. And things are going to be changing very quickly with all of the different investment that we're seeing in this country now as a result of the reopening of relations with China. A lot of things have changed very rapidly. There are a lot of, you know, foreign business people here, and that's all seen as very positive. And that's taking place in Honduras as well, and everywhere else. Honduras is another country that has very staggering levels of inequality. And, you know, people live in shacks. People live in really substandard conditions. And that stands to change now that we have partners who are, you know, that we can trust, that aren't here solely to take the resources of the land, but actually to help us develop so that people can live more dignified lives.
So can you speak a little bit about those changes? And I mean, you've kind of talked about this, you've kind of talked about the Monroe Doctrine, which is this year marks 200 years of the Monroe Doctrine. You've talked about how the US imperialist presence across really the whole of Latin America. And now you were talking about some economic changes that are happening. So 2 questions on that. One, how do you see US's commitment to the Monroe Doctrine for Latin America? Like, has it changed? Has it increased? Has it Where is that right now? And also how does that affect, or really, it's like a status update question. Where is the struggle for Latin America, for free and independent Latin America today?
Yeah, it's like I said, the U.S. intervention in our region is ongoing, and it's not hard to spot. They use the same template every time. I in recent years have read a couple of books on the different coups that have taken place in 2002 against Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and then this book that was that I just picked up again because I was actually trying to see what Mel Zelaya had to say about Israel's presence in Latin America, but it's on the coup that took place against Manuel Zelaya in 2009 in Honduras. And you know, I became a little bit interested in it because, of course, of everything that took place in 2019 in Bolivia. And really, they do, the US does the same stuff every time. And yet we find ourselves here in Latin America, or you guys or anyone else who covers Latin America from an anti-imperialist perspective, trying to convince people that it is a coup, or trying to convince people that it's really happening, or that the US is involved in it, because the argument is always that that it's just national actors, that there's genuine there is genuine sort of backlash against these governments, that there are movements within the country that oppose these socialist governments, and so that's actually legitimate. That's what people try to argue. And so they argue that, you know, so the right had to take them out of power, so the people were protesting. That's completely false. And I'll read just the back of this book, this one that I was that Mel Zelaya gave us last year on the commemoration of 14 years since the coup in Honduras, which was June of 2009. He wrote this book to talk about you know, the events that took place sort of hour by hour. And I think it's really interesting because if you see the people who were persecuted during the dictatorship during these last 14 years, you see the importance of this process that Honduras is living right now to try to take control of the country, to try to take control of its territory once again, to end these different policies that were imposed by the US-backed government. But he says that, you know, the coup that took place was a transnational, this is in Spanish, so I'm just translating it, was a transnational conspiracy that culminated with the breaking of the constitutional order and my overthrow. He says it's the greatest act of corruption, of it was an act of corruption. It had to do with illicit association and organized crime, that it saw the participation of business people, of religious groups, of different intelligence organizations, with the aims of ensuring that their businesses and concessions and to ensure the interests of corporations. And he said that the reason why they carried this out was to interrupt the process of integration of Latin America. And yeah, and so, you know, what he says there is that, you know, with the participation of all of these different groups, the religious groups, the businesses, the corporations and stuff like that, you know, coups in Latin America and intervention in Latin America on a whole, because most intervention isn't coups, it's just other forms of intervention. It uses all of these different entities now. It's largely, you know, they're intervening intercontinent, using these NGOs, using nonprofit, using the flags of feminism, of LGBT rights, of progress, and that they try to embed themselves, the United States, you know, and the forces of imperialism are kind of embedding themselves in, you know, in leftist movements and using sort of leftist terminology and stuff like that. And so that's sort of what Monroe Doctrine looks like right now. It's not going to always be an outright attempt to overthrow a government. It is largely, the US has this whole campaign right now where it's so concerned about the Amazon. The Amazon, which there's like 7 countries or something that have Amazon, and then obviously Colombia and Brazil, Bolivia, and others. And so the US is parading around at the United Nations and all these different fora in order to talk about how this is the lungs of the world and how we need to preserve all these different environments and species and things like that. But really, we know that the U.S. military itself is one of the, or if not the largest contributor to climate change and everything that that leads to that, and that also the sort of operations that are carried out by those US-based corporations and those multinational corporations is what's actually causing all of the damage to the global South. And so, I mean, I don't know how to sum up that my answer to the question, but just to say that the U.S. is intervening in our countries and endless types of in endless forms that sometimes look exactly how they looked in years past, in the form of funneling money to opposition leaders, in the forms of funneling resources to opposition parties to try to overthrow a government, but also just with their presence in the form of the different companies and different tools and mechanisms they have for trying to enter into our countries.
Camilla has beautiful weather and a socialist government, and we're moving on to Britain, which unfortunately has neither of those things. But just sort of thinking about different forms of imperialist intervention, as the junior partner of the US, Britain has largely followed the same imperialist policies towards Latin America, or certainly similar policies. For example, effectively stealing over £1 billion worth of Venezuela's gold, which prevented, among other things, Venezuela from funding vital services. Thinking also about, for example, Juan Guaido, the British government decided to recognize Juan Guaido as the so-called self-declared leader of Venezuela. And there's just a sort of couple of questions here. Firstly, obviously, like I said, we're based in Britain, and so a significant amount of our listeners are based here. And the British government play an active imperialist role and is participating in escalating the Cold War. How can we in Cold War Britain align with movements in Latin America that are against the Cold War? And how do we sort of build our campaign? Are there any sort of lessons we can draw from some of the experiences there? And then just a sort of quicker second point, are there any words of optimism and inspiration that you can share with us to help us close off the year? For example, it could even just be a book recommendation or New Year's resolutions for the British left.
I think we're in a very good position right now because, as I've said, the sort of popular education that has taken place as a result of the genocide taking place in Gaza, that people are really questioning the mainstream narratives. And so I think it's particularly important for people in countries in the global north to continue to call on their governments to lift unilateral coercive measures, to lift the sanctions against countries like Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Bolivia, but also all the countries of the mostly global south that are being sanctioned right now by those same countries that are targeted, despite that they're countries that have suffered from slower development. And it's just a very large scale crime that was committed there with what you said, the theft of $1 billion worth of Venezuelan gold. I think that that should have been and should continue to be a very large campaign in Britain, because the scale of stuff that took place, and it's just everybody said it before. The Venezuelan government and the people of Venezuela denounced it at the time in 2019, when Juan Guaido was swearing himself in the middle of the street, and all the different actions he took, the different actions that the opposition did, and all the different things the US was doing. But it becomes very clear now, thanks to books and documents and all these revelations, that in fact the whole point of the coup against Venezuela in those years was to steal Venezuela's resources. It's completely absurd that they would steal the resources of a Latin American country of that size, of just 30 million people. To have such wealthy countries participate in that theft is absolutely disgusting, but it's exactly what's happening in all parts of the world now. That is the same sort of theft pillaging that's taking place in Africa and in Asia and all around the rest of Latin America. But it's just been done out in the open. And that's what's so completely absurd. And so I don't know. I'm not particularly hopeful that the people of Britain will look to their own government, but I think that it's very important that they use that as an example among many others to see that Britain is committing crimes, imperialist crimes around the world. That it's not just the US. And people in these countries, particularly in Europe, but also Canada, have this tendency to pretend like the bad guy is the US. And they have this sort of complex that at least we're not the US. At least we have medical care. At least we have dental. At least people are able to retire at a dignified age, or whatever it is. That sort of comparison that people make is just absolutely absurd, because Britain and the people who live there benefit from the exploitation of people of the global South. That's quite literally how you get your development. That's literally how these countries are founded, or cities are built, and everything else. And still today, it's how you get your food and other things, and technology. It's through exploiting people in the global South, as well as our resources, and also through just mass murder and everything that's required in that process. So I think that really in the global North, and I feel that because I live in Latin America now. So when I do go back, for example, to Canada, I feel it's just so crazy and mind-blowing to me that you live a certain way there, and people in other countries are still moving things around by mule or by horse, and that's still how they live, because it's cheaper than buying gas or whatever it is, and that we don't have roads. I'm here on a dirt road, but it's not because it's a bad thing. It's still it's a good thing. It's a road, but there are just some sort of substandard conditions that we still face in Latin America that we don't even have the option of moving out of right at this time, because we don't financial restrictions and things like that. And I think that as far as people have been able to open their eyes and see sort of the role that the global North and NATO countries have played in either supplying directly or indirectly the Zionist military with resources, with financial support and all of that, to commit those atrocities and commit the ongoing genocide, these same governments are funding our underdevelopment, and in other cases they're quite literally starving the people of the global South through their unilateral coercive measures, and also depriving them of vital medicines and other supplies through those sanctions and through other measures. And so those are sort of the things that people need to be thinking of when living in those countries. It's not that you need to walk around feeling guilty all of the time, but just know that that wherever you live, we all have a place within the international system that is capitalism that we live under right now. And the place of Britain or the role of Britain is to exploit the global South, just to simplify it. But and then, the other question you said is any last words of optimism. Well, I think that the most important thing that we can do in Latin America, and what I would say to other Latin Americans in Latin America, but I would also say to anyone anywhere, is just that we have to study and remember our history. All of our answers are there. There's nothing that we can't find an answer to by looking at all of the popular struggles of our continent, and the reasons why people fought against the dictatorships and the repression, everything that took place in those decades, well, in the last century. And I think that because we forget about the struggles of our parents and stuff like that, we are we're very vulnerable to sort of like the different, I would say, CIA or intelligence designed and manufactured campaigns, and the different strategies they've had to try to move us away from the most the most important, I guess, ideologies that we could use as tools in order to liberate ourselves from the system of imperialism and capitalism. We're just going to have absolutely no way of combating neoliberalism and combating imperialism in Latin America without taking the lessons of the past and without reflecting on history. And so the best way for us to do that, besides, in addition to reading, reading Marx, reading Lenin, and all sorts of other things, is just an overall study of the revolutionary processes of Latin America, and that includes, of course, the processes that are continue to unfold in Nicaragua and Venezuela and Cuba, and of course the process led by Evo Morales in Bolivia. And that continues to be the hope for Latin America. That continues to be the source of optimism that I have, is that, time and time again, there are certain sort of elders in our Latin America, which anytime anything happens, whether it's in Palestine, whether it's in Russia and Ukraine, or anything else, that they always have the correct analysis. And the reason these people have the correct analysis of everything that's taken place is because they haven't forgotten history, and because they've been studying it so closely. And just speaking from where I am, it's just so inspiring that this country has moved, has always progressed forward, with the demands of its people, who have demanded, more equality among women and men, more equality among different groups of people, including LGBT people, including rural people, people of the Caribbean coast, and have worked to make different advancements to ensure that people are included, that this is a more inclusive society where people have economic rights, genuine economic rights, and not just fake symbolic things. And so, every country is different, and sometimes I struggle because I'm literally talking about too many countries at the same time. But I think it's very it is very inspiring that there's so many people in a country like Nicaragua that support the revolutionary government here, that support all of the different policies that they've taken. And I think that it has to serve as a compass for the rest of Latin America, that right now is, subject to this sort of curse or whatever it is of social democracy, because social democracy is just an attack on communism. It really is just an attack on anti-imperialism and our efforts to liberate ourselves from imperial domination. What we need is to build political power that will, but also bearing in mind that the objective is to live in free societies, to live in independent societies where workers and people have control of our resources, have control of the state and state power, and we're able to put in popular governments that can actually do the things that we want them to do and make positive change that we will instantly be able to see. We don't need governments who are going to go put on a PR show online and say a bunch of things that are progressive or say things that are seemingly pro-woman or anything like that. If we did want that, we would elect Justin Trudeau's across the country, across the continent, in fact, because that is precisely what the government of Canada, as an example, among others, among other mostly European governments have done, is that they've elected all of these different governments who say the right things, particularly with regards to women, LGBT people, people with different abilities, people with disabilities, or whatever it is that how they're framing it. They talk about mental health and all these different things, but a lot of the issues that that we deal with, whether it's in Canada or here in Nicaragua, or that we need some access to equal economic rights. What we need is not symbols, but we need the rights to be able to own a home, to be able to afford rent, to have shelter overhead and things like that. And those are things that we should all be fighting for. People shouldn't be fighting for on such a narrow basis. We don't need to be divided up into subcategories based on all these different identities. We need to think of ourselves as one whole working class and really push for change that will affect and positively impact all of us, regardless of race, regardless of our immigration status, regardless of anything. We need to be changing, we need to be pushing for economic change. And I think that that's something that, that sort of understanding and class analysis is something that is very, it still exists in countries like Nicaragua, and is being sort of erased in other countries. And I don't want to single out other countries because people get so upset when they think that you're targeting their countries, unfortunately. But the fact is that we still have the sort of class analysis in places like Nicaragua. And so I think that's going to be the answer going forward. If we want to make any fundamental changes and, really combat the sort of evils of neoliberalism in the future, is that we need to build sort of these broader movements. And I really hope that that through studying the cases of the processes like the Sandinista revolution, that people will derive some inspiration there in Britain.
Like you're saying, the PR show, the PR online show is so pervasive in the global north. I'm going to ask you for two types of recommendations right now. Just one, which is like where someone could read something about Latin America specifically, about their history, that you would, a book or something they would recommend in that category. And then, of course, Kawsachun news. And well, for our No Cold War Britain, we have Fiona Edwards' blog, Eyes on Latin America. But can you also recommend something contemporary that people can listen to, read, explore, in your opinion, would give people a better understanding of Latin America?
Yeah. Well, I should have thought of a couple things in advance. I do want to say that the sort of writing that has been put out by is it Francisco, our Chilean comrade there in the UK? Is it Francisco? What's his last name? Dominguez. Sorry, Francisco Dominguez. So he has actually been writing some of the best things that we've seen in English. He's very knowledgeable in history. And I saw that just today he has written an article on the Essequibo, which has been first published in Morning Star. and he's had some of the best analysis of different things, not only of Chile, but he obviously is in the Venezuela Solidarity Coalition, I believe, there, and but has also followed Nicaragua and many other things. And so I think that in Britain, he is one of the most trustworthy sources. And I think because of COVID and everything else, he hasn't been in Latin America for a few years, but we hope to see him again. There's also, I think, some very important, I guess, sort of a network of writers that have long done work in solidarity with Nicaragua and have done a lot of writing and reporting on Nicaragua. And, now it's kind of known as the Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition. It's very new. The coalition itself was formed last year and is in the process right now of, it has like kind of a makeshift website, but it's in the process of launching a new website, which should be ready early next year. And it's going to be a really incredible resource for all this range of writers. And I could just name the writers, and I will, although it'd be very much more readily available and easier to navigate once the website is ready. But we have people like John Perry, who of course you guys would be familiar with, who's a British author. We have also Stephen Sefton, who has lived here for about almost 30 years in Nicaragua, who was Irish, but of course is a naturalized Nicaraguan citizen. He has done a lot of really important writing, not only on Nicaragua, but also on things like the NATO proxy war against Russia, and other issues as well. There are another thing that Stephen Sefton has done is provided a lot of really important translations of interviews from Nicaragua and Latin America that wouldn't otherwise be available in English. That's something that Kawsachun News tries to do as well. And he has a website called Tortilla con Sal. And it's a very bare minimum website, but you can find a lot of really good articles there that I feel represent the sort of attitudes and outlooks from Latin America. So I would recommend the Tortilla con Sal blog. And also, one thing that has come out of kind of this solidarity with Nicaragua network of people is that there are two comrades, Nan McCurdy and Barbara Larkham, among a couple others, who are hosting these weekly webinars, or not weekly, monthly webinars, sometimes with a couple of extra events. And those are all, of course, online, and they focus on different areas of Nicaraguan society or issues that tend to come into the headlines, such as the police in Nicaragua, or such as Nicaraguan state and the government, because of course, or the Nicaraguan state and the churches, rather, because we have seen a lot of headlines in the mainstream media that has tried to portray Nicaragua as being at odds with the Catholic Church and things like that. So those have been like a very important, I would say, source for information, where sometimes they're able to get in government officials here who are able to speak on these issues, but other experts and people who live here as well, who speak English, or sometimes people who speak Spanish with simultaneous interpretation. And I think that's really important, because it can be very difficult to find information on these things. I find that even people with the best of intentions from the global north and English-speaking countries, when they're looking for information on on these different countries, because they see a headline in the news, their first instinct is just to Google these issues. And if you use Google, you're always going to see the same search results, and you're always going to see, whether it be mainstream US media or mainstream international media. Also, a lot of the opposition outlets are the top results. So in the case of Nicaragua, you see Confidencial and La Prensa. Those are outlets that are run by the opposition out of the US and out of Costa Rica, that have no real basis in the reality of Nicaragua. So I think it's really important to look to those sources. sometimes I don't even know where you find books like this, but this is the book that I mentioned earlier. It's El Golpe 28J. It's like the coup of July 28th, which was written by Mel Zelaya, and he talks about how the coup was carried out there in Tegucigalpa against him. It's very it is very interesting because it shows the important role that the different revolutionary forces of Latin America played when they came to his rescue, when he was I guess taken by the military and all of that. They had an emergency ALBA meeting here in Managua, actually, with the presence of President Hugo Chavez, Evo Morales. Actually, I think Maduro came as well. He must have been, I'm not sure what position in government he was, and Daniel Ortega. And I think that is just a really good look at sort of, some of the more recent Latin American history. So I'll leave you with those recommendations.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
That's amazing, and I'm sure listeners will appreciate all those recommendations. We just want to say thanks so much, Camila. It's been incredibly insightful and both politically and ideologically powerful discussion. And to follow Camila's work, which we would strongly recommend you do, her Twitter, or rather X handle, is @Camila Press, and to follow Kawsachun News on X is @Kawsachun News. Excuse me for the pronunciation. And if you don't already follow the work of No Cold War Britain, which of course without bias we also recommend you do, the X Twitter handle is @NCW Britain, Facebook is @No Cold War Britain, and Instagram @NoColdWar_Britain. I would also add we look forward very much to speaking to Camila again sometime in the future, where we will, I'm sure, hear about further progress and indeed struggles across Latin America and beyond. And listeners, we look forward to you tuning in next time. And of course, given the context that we're discussing this podcast within, we all hope for a free Palestine. And lastly, you all know the drill. Please like and subscribe and leave any comments below.
Bye. Thank you so much, Camila, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, guys.